Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel SQL Edge. Today we are here to understand one of the important topics with respect to the interviews as well as for the basics to understand about the identity column. We know in SQL Server, whenever we insert a new row into a table that has an identity column, SQL Server will automatically generate a unique value. Most commonly, this identity column is used on a primary columns, right? So whenever a new unique value is generated by the SQL Server, that value, if you want to get the value, we have to write some sort of a SQL command. But in SQL Server, if we say like we want to get that newly generated value immediately after inserting, how to get that? Okay, so in this video, I will explain the different ways to get the last generated identity value in a SQL Server. So there are multiple methods we are having to retrieve the last generated identity. So we are going to learn in this video what is attached identity, what is scope identity, what is ident current, and with some best examples by writing the queries, we will understand how we can get the last generated identity values immediately after inserting the data into the table. Let's create one sample table for that one, and we will see the examples of each of them. So I'm going to create one sample table in a tutorial database. I'm writing a query for creating a simple table. My table name is like create employee. I'm going to create a sample table with just 3 columns. One of the columns will be an identity column. So I'm creating an identity column with starting value as 1 and increment by 1. Second column I'm having is an employee name, which will be an varchar column. And third column will be having a department column, which will be saying us like this employee belongs to which department. So this is the table we have just created, and let's see the data now. Currently we don't have any data into this table. As we see in the result set, we are not seeing any records into this specific table. If we execute the query, okay, let's insert some sample data. Insert into, we know the syntax, insert into employees, and then we are going to insert employee name and department. As the employee ID column is an identity, we are not supposed to provide the values for those. If we provide the values, it will throw an error saying like cannot insert the values explicitly into an identity column. So let me insert some 2 records here, employee 1, and same way we will insert one more employee with some other department, set IT. So I have inserted the 2 values here, and we could see the identity value is generated employee ID 1 and 2. That will be an auto incremented values we are having. So let's dig into now the different methods to get and last generated identity value. Right? Commonly the identity columns is created on a primary keys. Those are the auto incremented numeric columns automatically generate the unique values. So we are going to see how we can return the last generated identity value using 3 different kinds of functions or system functions, or we can say system variables. The very first in that list is an at identity. So at identity is an global variable, or we can say a system function that returns the last generated identity value in the current session across any table. Right? So at identity is something we are having that will give you a last generated identity value in the current session and across any table. In the sense, we are having this SQL query window. So in this SQL query window, in any of the table, we are having the identity column and we insert the data. The at identity will give you the last generated identity value. For an example, I'm going to insert the value into the employees table. Once again, we are having a different column name. So insert the value. It's saying invalid column name. So let's change the column name here and insert the next record. So I'm inserting the one record into the employee table, and we know like we have just inserted one record into the employee table. And now let's see what will be the last generated identity value using attach identity. So I'm selecting that attach identity using this syntax. This is a standard syntax to get the value. I'm giving one alias name here, last identity value. Execute this query and we will see we are getting the last identity value as a 3. Let's check the table to understand whether it is correct or not. Yes, this is the last generated row we are having, and the employee ID is 3 here. Right. So we got it like using attach identity, we can see what is the last generated identity value we are having on any table in the current session. Right. So apart from employee table, let's say we are having one more table, department, and in that table we have inserted the value. Okay, and on that department table as well, if we have the identity column, it will give the last value generated, last identity value generated in the department table. So we can say the attach identity will return the last generated identity value in the current session, but across any table. Work across the session, right? Not restricted to the current scope. Session, we are saying in the session means in this current session we can have a trigger on this employee table. So if we have the trigger in this employee table, and in that trigger we are inserting the data into some log tables, and in the log table we are having again an identity column. So attach identity may return the value that is created as a part of an trigger as well. But we want to see the last generated identity value for the employee. But what will happen if attach identity we are using, it may give the identity value generated by the trigger as well. Right. So this is the cons we can say for the attach identity. It can return the values from the triggers leading to the unexpected result. So whenever we want to see the last generated identity value for this in this session, and for this table only, attach identity cannot be more useful. So this is not safe in complex scenarios with multiple tables and triggers. So if we have the triggers, we should not use attach identity to get the last generated identity value. Got it? Second we are having is a scope identity. Let me check. Scope identity. So scope identity is again one of the method to get the last generated identity value in a SQL Server. Whenever we have an identity column on any table, we can use scope identity to get the last generated identity value. What is the difference between the identity at identity and scope identity? So scope identity will returns the identity value generated in the current scope only. So even though if we have any triggers on this employees table, we will not get the identity value generated by the trigger. We will get only the identity value that is generated in this particular table. So whenever we want to see the last generated identity value on a specific table, we can go with the scope identity. Let's see an example. If I am inserting one record into this employee table once again, and if I select the scope identity to get the last identity value, I can get the last identity value as a 4. We can see we are having total 4 records in this table, and latest inserted record is having the ID as a 4. So scope identity will return the identity from the current scope. Even though if we have any triggers, it will not return the value generated by the triggers. So it will ignore the identities generated by the triggers. That is why this is the safest choice in most real world cases. Okay, so most of the time in the project, in the real world projects, we will use scope identity to get the last generated identity value. The cons of this is limited to the current scope. if let's say this employee table, we are inserting data into some other query window, right? So let's check this one. If we are inserting data into some other employee table, in this query window, I'm inserting one more record, that is a fifth record, and I'm trying to get the data into this another query window. I will still get the 4, but in fact in this employee table we have now 5 records. So that is one of the cons we can say. It will not get the latest generated identity value from the another scope. This is limited to the current scope only, right? Then third we are having is a ident current. So this is again one of the method to return the last generated identity value in a SQL Server. This will return the last identity value generated for a specific table. So both of these attach identity and scope identity, we are not providing any table name here to this function, to this system variable. So basically this both of these function and system variable will give you the last generated identity value on any table in the current and in the across the sessions, right? On any table. So we are inserting employee, so we are getting that. If we are inserting the data into some other table which is having the identity column, so this scope identity at identity will return the identity value from that table, right? The third method we are having to get the last generated identity value is ident current. So here this ident current will return the last identity value generated for a specific table, right? And this specific table we can get the last generated identity value for across any session, right? Which means if we are having a table and this table is used in a multiple stored procedures to insert the data, right, we can get the latest generated identity value by passing the table name as an input to the ident current system function, and it will give you the last generated identity value on that specific table. Let's insert one record here, and we can see ident current will give you the last generated identity value as a 6. Let's check. Okay, I have passed the incorrect name. This is an employee table. I'm trying to pass the employees table. So employees table does not exist. That's why it is not giving any current generated identity value. So change the table name to employee, and we will see we are having the last generated identity value as a 6. Even though I'm inserting the record into another session, let's say I'm giving some other name Sean and trying to get the ident current value for the employee table in a different session, still I will get the latest generated identity value, which is nothing but 7, right? So ident current is binded to a specific table, whereas identity and scope identity are not limited to any specific table, but those work on a session wise data, right? So let's see some pros. So this ident current will retrieve the data or last generated identity value for a specific table. It is independent of scope and session. So across any session, across any scope, we insert the data, it will get the last generated identity value. This is good for debugging and auditing across multiple users. So if multiple users are trying to use the employee table to insert the data across multiple stored procedures, still we can use this ident current to get the latest generated identity value, right? This will returns the last identity regardless of session. So in multi-user environment, it might not belong to your insert, right? So if we are trying to see what is the identity value inserted by me, but there are some other users also there which are inserting the data, so we may not get the value which is inserted by yourself only. So there is a risk of this concurrency issue, right? So let's summarize this. Use the scope identity in most cases because it will ignore the triggers, right? This is the best practice to use the get the last generated identity value. Use ident current only when you need to check a table's last identity value across session. If you want to see the last generated identity value for any specific table, we will use the ident current, and we should use the attach identity because it will we are not sure like if there are triggers or not. So if we are sure like if there are no triggers, we can go with that identity, but most of the time it should be ignored, right? So this is what we were having for today's session. We have just seen the different ways to get the last generated identity value in a SQL Server, which is having an identity column on a table. So just conclude it. SQL Server provide three main functions to fetch the last identity value. We are recommending to use the scope identity for most real-time use cases. Coming up next, we will see different topics in a SQL Server like procedures, CTs, and much more. Apart from that, we will be starting the SQL Server from very basics as a playlist or as a series on our YouTube channel SQL Edge. So kindly subscribe and click on the bell icon to get the notifications whenever we upload a new video. Thank you all.